It is very important in research to know how to do research in translation studies, and there are a few tips which I would like to give you, which are drawn heavily from a book called The Map, which is in translation studies by Williams and Chesterman, 2001-2011. Now, these tips will help you a lot in knowing how you do your research, and you know the aim, you know what hypothesis to use, and how to test it, and so on. So it's quite a very useful book to actually refer to. Now, according to the book, I'm going to give you some of the information about the book, and it will be just few tips really about research in translation studies. Now, for the first thing is about the aim of the research in translation studies, which is to contribute to the actual field, and that is to increase the sum of knowledge about this field. And the contribution can be in the form of a new data, or it could be that you are suggesting to give an answer to a specific issue or a specific problem. That would be number two. So it could be either you're providing new data, or you are trying to give an answer to a specific problem or an issue. That would be the second one. Or you're trying to test or refine a hypothesis which already exists, or a theory which already exists, or a methodology which already exists. The fourth element, so now new data, or answering a specific issue, or testing, refining hypothesis or theory or methodology that exists. Or it can be you are proposing a new idea, or a new hypothesis, or a new theory, or new methodology. So it could be either you are testing an existing methodology, or you are proposing new methodology or new thesis, hypothesis, or new theory, or new idea, or new concept. So these are the four things. So new data, suggesting an answer to a specific issue or problem. That would be one of your contributions in your research. Or you could be testing an existing concept or theory or hypothesis or methodology, or it could be proposing a new concept or hypothesis or theory or methodology. That would be the now may I advise, and also the book advises as well, that you have a little bit of experience of translating, either whether translating in class or translating professionally in a setting which is a professional, like in for a company, or so these will be very, very important. Also, when you're choosing a topic, it has to have your personal interest in it, that you are interested in it, that you have enthusiasm about, for the research that you are doing. And your initial idea that you have in mind, you need to test and see if it exists. Even though it's exciting, it might be already done by somebody else before you. So, and it might not be feasible. It might not be worth researching. So it's important to be able to know about it, collect some knowledge. And if your research does not add the sum of knowledge, which is the purpose of your research, then it's not considered to be a good research. So you need to know the current state of research, in the field about the initial idea that you have in mind. So you are undertaking, this undertaking that you are doing here is not going to be out in a vacuum, but it has to be related to previous works, previous researches, and previous things done before. Because what's done before, maybe it's worthless according to you, but you need to substantiate, bring evidence to prove your own opinion and justify your own approach as well. Now here you need to put, to the initial idea, you need to put a plan. And of course you need to read sources in a critical way. You don't just read them. What does it mean in a critical way? You have to read them deeply. You have to read key texts intensively, as the book is saying by Chesterman and Williams. You need to re-repeat the reading of this information and see if it's giving you new ideas or new information, and whether you understand the main points of it, and also whether you can scan very quickly the facts and figures as well. So that is what you do. You bring all these sources, but when you bring them, you need to actually then say whether you agree with them, or you're unconvinced with their argument, or you're not convinced, or you don't agree with them, or you find an important point that's been discussed by them which you want to actually focus upon, and it hasn't been focused upon, it has been overlooked by other scholars, but you are going to focus upon it. So these are quite important elements here. Now, the areas in translation research, according to Williams and Chesterman, there are 12. And these 12, the first one is the obvious one, which is text analysis and translation. In other words, you analyze the source text and you compare the translation to the source text. So ST and TT are compared together. That would be one way. Or you can compare translations of the same text. Translations in the same area. For example, in the medical field, you have these translations, you compare between them, you compare them, not between them, you compare them with non-translated texts. So you compare translated texts with non-translated texts. That's the second one. So the first one, you are comparing translations and their source text. Second one, you're comparing translations with non-translated texts. That's the second one. The third one, which is your own translation with annotated or commentary that comes with it. And that would be the third under the first item, which is text analysis and translation. The second area in translation research is translation quality assessment. And there are lots of scholars. I would mention Nord, Wills, Julian House, and Nord. All of these scholars who are into this area called translation quality assessment. The third one is genre translation. That's another area in translation research. And this genre translation can be literary, multimedia. In the literary, you talk about either in genres. There is drama, poetry, prose, whatever. And there is multimedia texts, there is religious texts, children's literature, tourism texts, technical texts, and legal texts. Of course, in the multimedia translation, you can go for different types of audiovisual translation and the web and multimedia translation. You can go for that as well. This is, and then we have, you can go for an area called translation and technology, and in this one you evaluate a software, or you look at software localization, or you look at effects of technology on translation, for example, or website translation, or technology and translator training. So you can look at the training and technology for example, S.r.l and other systems that are used in a machine translation, or CAT, which is computer-assisted translation. And you look at all the various softwares as well and analyze. And that requires also technical side. Now there is also what's called the translation history, and then here you focus on the translators themselves under the title who. Or in the translation history, you look at the what, which is you are investigating what texts are translated or not translated in a particular time for a particular culture, for example. You can do that as well. You can look at whys, which is the reasons why for translating certain texts at a particular period of time. Or you can look at how, which means you look at the translation strategies throughout the ages. What are the strategies used? What are the procedures used? And the procedures are more localized and strategies are more general. You could also look at what's called translation ethics, and that's number 7. And there where you look at types of ethics, different types of ethics in translation or in culture and ideology factors. And in the ideology, for example, you look at these factors that affect the translation in one way or another, whether they are culture factors or ideological factors. And there's also what's called codes of conduct or codes of practice. And then also you look at in the practice about deadlines and how you deal with the clients and so on and so forth. Terminology is number 8, which is another area in research, translation research. Terminologies and glossaries, you can look at that as well and see how the terms are translated, and look at various dictionaries, and then look at it from that angle. There's also in translation studies, if we are to consider interpreting as part of translation studies, in interpreting, you can look at either the mode first and know it is simultaneous or consecutive or both that you want to do together, or you want to look at a social context or situation. You want to talk about conference interpreting, liaison interpreting, dialogue interpreting, court interpreting. You can do that as well. And of course, there are in interpreting some other aspect which is related to cognitive studies, where you talk about neurophysiological studies of the brain of the interpreter when it is in action. You can also look at another topic in cognitive studies is the functioning of the interpreter's, not brain, but mind in simultaneous interpreting. Or you look at the effect of time lag, for example, that is related to behavioral studies or linguistic studies or interpreter training or quality assessment. Number 10, you can look at also what's called the translation process. And here I think it's more looking into the workplace studies relating to the lives and the conditions of the translators, professional translators, of course, whether they provide them with all the various conditions that are required for their comfort, for the safety, and so on, especially if you're talking about the interpreters with regards to safety, especially in a war zone when they are interpreting. There are also what's called protocol studies, which think about the think aloud protocol, where you are investigating how the translator translates. So how do they do that? Some translators can actually verbalize what they are having in mind when they are translating a certain text, and this is recorded and then analyzed. Or it could be, it's actually really this think aloud protocol is more or less, it's an internal decision-making process which is happening in the mind of the interpreter. It's like the black box, and what happens to the black box in the mind of the interpreter when they are interpreting and when they are translating as well. There's what's called 11 is translator training, and here you look at the curriculum design and various ways of training. What are the courses that are used for training translators, and which courses are taught and how useful they are and so on. What's their specifications and what are their plans and what are their exercises and so on. There's the translation profession as well. You can look at the profession in terms of employment, certification, association, membership, and that is number 12 as an area in translation research. Now, we have finished with the translation research, or we have finished with these translation research areas, and now we're going to move on to what's called the theoretical models of translation, and there are many models, but there is what's called the comparative models. Comparative models, they are the ones that help in the description of the product, translation product, and they answer the question, what, about the actual text. Process models, number 2, there are 3 models, of course, so we're talking about either comparative models, process models, or casual models. Comparative models, you are talking about the product itself, the translation product, the text itself, and answering some questions about what. Process models, number 2, is looking at the sender, the message, and the receiver. And here you focus on the problem-solving procedures. That is, this kind of models will help describe the process, the translation process, answering when, the question when. Causal models, however, which is the 3rd one, they look at cause and effect models, and that is to answer the question why, which include text and context variables. You know, the variables, contextual variables are included, and what effect the translation causes. This is another important one. Now, then we move on to what's called hypothesis. Now, of course, hypothesis is part of research, and Hempel, in 1952, he says that a hypothesis is a tentative claim, an attempt at generalization, is an attempt to capture a pattern or a regularity which is being observed. And that is what hypothesis is. So you are putting forward a claim when you are trying to actually investigate in your research a certain problem. And that claim could be an attempt, or it could be a claim about a tentative one you have in mind, or an attempt to generalize, or it could be an attempt to capture a pattern. You look at various texts and they give you a pattern. There's a pattern there in between them, or a regularity in the texts that you are looking at in your hypothesis. Or you're trying to look at these texts as in general, to generalize, to say all the texts are doing this. Of course, you can generalize on a small scale, because you're not going to use massive number of texts in your analysis, so that is you cannot generalize that big. You have to be careful in your generalizations. In terms of what type of hypotheses what are the types of hypotheses, there are 4 according to Williams and Chesterman, and these 4 are the last 2 are similar, opposite to each other, and the first 2 are in a way it's quite different to each other. The first one is interpretive hypothesis, which is you are focusing in your research about only definitions and the classifications of the items that you are finding there. So you are focusing what's the definition of whatever you are investigating, and what are the types or the classifications, how do you want to classify all these various findings that you have. It could be number 2, which is these 4 types of hypothesis, which is descriptive hypothesis, which is focusing on the examples, on the analysis of the examples, all instances of a certain example. And this, for example, you are focusing on, let's say, the connectives in your study, all the connectives of and but and however, and of a given type or a given under a certain for a certain text type, and you want to discuss it, and you have observed that. So you're trying to say you are differentiating between the examples in a descriptive way. And this one, of course, this hypothesis is not the same as the first one. The first one is the first one is definitions and classifications. This one is aiming to generalize. The third one, and to generalize but not to explain. The third one is explanation, explanatory. It's telling why this is happening. You have noticed there is a phenomenon which you have noticed, and it seems to be caused by certain factors, and you are saying these are the factors A, B, C, and that's what you are investigating. So you're investigating the actual phenomenon which is caused by a certain factors or conditions. There is number 4, which is predictive hypothesis, which is the last one here, where you talk about the conditions and the factors that tend to cause the phenomenon. So it's reversed. The explanatory is talking about the phenomenon. The predictive is talking about the conditions and factors. The explanatory talks about the phenomenon, which is caused by certain conditions. You realize that after you study it, cause and effect. Whereas predictive, you look at the conditions and the factors which are causing or influencing a specific phenomenon. And that's what you do. And of course, in the if you want to look at testing the hypothesis first, you need to operationalize. Operationalizing the hypothesis will be to reduce it to concrete terms. In other words, you have to bring some examples and test them and see how they work. And of course, another reason for operationalizing them is that to ensure that your research is reliable. That is a very, very important thing. And you need to explain your procedure very, very clearly. It has to be very clear and objective, and it can be replicated by other scholars later on, after you finish. So in other words, other scholars or researchers after you can duplicate or replicate what you, not duplicate, but replicate what you have done in your procedures so that it becomes your work or research is considered to be reliable. How do you test it? How do you test that? It can be, you need to measure it. For example, you measure it by the number of, let's say, semantic shifts. Every 100 words, there's a semantic shifts of whatever. So you see if one language is closer to the original than another in terms of the shifts. Class shifts, unit shifts, and so on. Catford's shifts, if you want to go back to them in another video which I have recorded. Also, you can also operationalize the hypothesis. How? You can ask participants or people, informants, what we call informants in research. You can ask them to elicit their opinion. What do you think of this? What do you think of the shifts? What do you think of whatever you have got in your research? You ask them to elicit their opinion, to know what their opinion is. It is the method that you are using for measuring which needs to be valid here. Okay, when you're analyzing and selecting the data and analyzing the variables, whether they are text variables or context variables, you need to look at also the relation between these texts themselves. Now, I'm just gonna, when you are looking at these data, you will find a pattern which is relating these variables. For example, it's 10% here and 15%. Why? Because you have noticed that because of this. And in another page, it's the same thing, and in another page is the same, and another page is the same. So you seem to have some sort of a pattern. And that pattern, from that you can draw, or you might find a principle or a law which would explain that pattern for you in your research. Now, the data itself can change because you might be looking at, in translation studies, you can be looking at data where it's not focusing on the text as a whole, but focusing on grammatical structure, or focusing on lexical items, or on terminology and equivalence, or on translation problems, or translation strategies, or proposed solutions in the TT, or on term banks and glossaries. The data can be also about textual indicators such as ideology and power relations. It can be related to that data. But it also can be on the reliability or the readability rather, and the errors that are made, and the quality assessment of the translation itself, the comprehension and the reading speed, and that can be also need to be looked at. Of course, you can gather that through questionnaires, interviews, and structured tests if you want, specialized or specially structured, constructed texts. Data can be also used in historical research, which include texts about text, like documentary material about a certain text that's been translated, perhaps about translations and translators, about reviews, correspondence, paratexts like footnotes and endnotes, prefaces, book covers. These are information about the text which you are investigating, or bibliographies of translated works, or biographies of the translators as well, as Pym in 1998 was saying. Of course, in order to make your research better, you use what's called meta text, and meta text means in your writing is extremely important. Meta text is certain phrases that are used, set phrases that are used by scholars, which you need to use, which include as outlined above, as we saw in section blah blah blah, it seems to whatever, see below blah blah, or before proceeding further, may I summarize, or at this point let us summarize the main point or the main steps of the argument so far. Or we can see then that chapter 4 or chapter 3 is dealing with or deals with whatever. Or on the other hand, let's consider now a rather different interpretation of this statement. All of these are important. These are to help in the linking between passages as well, and linking between the ideas. Also, if you're linking between passages at the end of the passage, or the beginning of the passage, or the next passage or section, you need to link them. You need to also signpost using forward signposting and backward signposting. In other words, you are referring to certain headings and subheadings in your writing. And that is also very, very, very important in your writing as well. As I said about the claim earlier, claim is your own statement. What you are trying to say, or you want to argue, or it's your thesis or hypothesis. If there is no claim, your research will be just a summary of other people's work and a list of facts and examples, and you haven't contributed to anything, so because you are not actually telling us what you have as a stand or attitude of yours in the research. How do you know the quality of research? It's by its added value, what's called added value, bringing new argument, bringing a new view, bringing new information, bringing new data, new concepts, new methods. Also, when you are mentioning in your research, you need to mention if there are any certain topics which need to be researched further, and that would be just say you are conceding that there are some points which require further research and you haven't covered it yourself. So I mean, this is really mostly what I have need to actually give you for today about these kind of tips that you need to do in research when you are researching in translation studies.